One night in 1953, a man slammed his glass down and called Bumpy Johnson weak in front of every soul in that Harlem club. Rico had the crew. Rico had Brooklyn behind him. But within 6 hours, 4 men vanished, and blood traced a trail to the back door. We go back to the moment the music was still playing. Bumpy Johnson was not a loud man. He never needed to be. In Harlem, his name alone was enough to end arguments, clear rooms, and remind people exactly where the line was drawn. He was not the kind of man who raised his voice. He was the kind of man who raised one finger, and someone else's voice stopped forever. That night his power was challenged in the middle of his own territory, not in some dark alley, not in a whispered threat passed through a third party, out in the open, in front of witnesses, in front of people who owed him everything. And if he responded wrong, too fast, too slow, too loud, too weak, Harlem would read it. They always did. Power in that world was not a title. It was a daily performance. One bad night and everything he had built could begin to crack. The club had no sign above the door, and no name that anyone used in polite conversation. It sat on the west side of 125th Street, between a tailor shop that closed at 6 and a pharmacy that had been owned by the same family since 1941. From the outside, it looked like nothing under a single bulb above the frame, 2 steps down from the sidewalk level. From the inside, it was the most important room in Harlem on any given night, because the most important people in Harlem were inside it. The air was thick the way club air gets after 10 o'clock, cigarette smoke layered over spilled bourbon, layered over the specific human warmth of a room that had been full for hours. A saxophone player in the far corner was working through something slow and deliberate, the kind of melody that did not demand attention but filled every space that conversation left empty. The lights were low and yellow, the color of old photographs, the color of a city that had learned to conduct its real business after dark. Bumpy Johnson sat at the corner table nearest the back wall. This was always his table. Not because anyone had designated it formally, but because the arrangement had established itself years ago through the simple logic of his preferences, back to the wall-clear sightline to both the front entrance and the door that led to the kitchen and the alley beyond. He sat with 2 men he trusted, flanking him at a slight distance, and a glass of bourbon in front of him that he had been nursing for the better part of an hour. He was not a large man, but he was the kind of man whose stillness took up more space than other men's movement. People who entered the room found their eyes moving to him before they had consciously decided to look. He was 51 years old that October. He had been running Harlem's numbers operation and the broader network of protection and commerce that surrounded it for long enough that most of the neighborhood had no clear memory of what the arrangement had looked like before him. He was not beloved in the way that required visible warmth. He was respected in the way that required demonstrated consistency. The understanding built over 15 years that his word held and his reach was real, and the consequences of crossing either were not theoretical. Rico Morales came through the front door at 11:14. He was 26, compact, dressed in a jacket that was slightly too large for his frame in the way that suggested it had been bought for the occasion rather than from habit. He had 2 men with him, both larger, both wearing the flat expression of people present for function rather than thought. Rico moved through the room with the specific walk of a young man who has been told he is about to do something significant and has let that information affect his posture before he has earned the right to carry it. He went to the bar first, ordered something he did not drink, let his eyes move across the room in the way that was meant to look casual and communicated the opposite. Then he picked up his untouched glass and walked directly to Bumpy's table. He did not wait. He pulled out the chair across from Bumpy and sat down without acknowledgement, without greeting, without the smallest gesture toward the protocols that governed every interaction in that room. One of Bumpy's men was on his feet before Rico had fully settled into the chair. Bumpy placed 2 fingers flat on the table without looking at the man, and the man sat back down. Rico leaned forward. He smelled of drugstore cologne, and underneath it something sharper, the sweat of a man running on borrowed confidence in a room where the debt was about to come due. "I'm going to say something, and I'm only going to say it once," Rico said. He did not lower his voice. The nearest 4 tables could hear him clearly, and within seconds the saxophone in the corner was the only sound in the room that was not Rico's voice. "The people putting real money into this neighborhood right now, they don't answer to you. They don't need to. The shops that have been paying you every week, they've been having some conversations. Different conversations, with people who have more to offer than you do right now." He paused and let a slow smile move across his face. It was the smile of a man who believed he had just said the most important thing he would ever say. Bumpy looked at him. Not with anger. Anger would have been readable, and readable meant manageable. He looked at Rico the way a man looks at something he has already made a decision about and is simply waiting for the correct moment to act on. His face was completely still. His bourbon glass sat untouched. His hands were flat on the table. He did not speak. The silence spread outward from the table like something physical. Every person in that room felt it arrive. The saxophone player finished his phrase and did not begin another one. The bartender stopped moving. The conversations at surrounding tables did not pause. They simply ceased between one breath and the next, as if the room had collectively decided that what was happening at the corner table required its full and undivided attention. Rico held Bumpy's gaze for a few seconds, then pushed his chair back and stood. He said one more thing, something low, something delivered for Bumpy alone, and then he turned his back and walked toward the bar. In that room, turning your back on Bumpy Johnson was not a physical risk in that immediate moment. It was a statement. It told every person watching that Rico did not fear what turning his back communicated. And in a world where the communication of fear, or its absence, was a form of currency, that statement cost something the moment it was made. Bumpy watched him go. He did not move. He reached into his jacket, removed a small piece of paper, wrote one word on it, folded it once, and passed it to the man on his left without looking at him. Some police reports from that period note a minor disturbance at an unnamed establishment on 125th Street that evening, though no specific individuals were ever identified in the associated paperwork. The man read the note, stood up quietly, moved toward the back of the room. The door to the kitchen closed behind him with a sound that was barely audible over the resumed, careful conversations of people who had seen what they had seen and were already deciding how to describe it to the people who had not been there. Rico stood at the bar with his back to the room and his untouched drink in front of him. He had approximately 4 minutes remaining in which the night still belonged to him. The alley behind the club ran between 2 buildings that were dying at different speeds. The one on the left had lost its top floor to a fire 3 years earlier and never been properly repaired. The upper section was boarded and dark, and on windy nights, pieces of something unidentifiable came loose and fell into the alley without warning. The one on the right was structurally intact, but hollowed out a building that had been converted, reconverted, and finally abandoned to a series of short-term occupants who left behind layers of other people's decisions. The alley between them was narrow, darker than the street on either side, and had the specific smell of urban neglect, standing water, old metal, something organic and unpleasant that the cold only partially suppressed. It was not a place anyone chose to be at 11:30 on a Thursday night. Rico came out through the side exit 4 minutes after Bumpy's man left the main room. He had not been pulled or pushed or threatened. He had been approached at the bar by a man he did not know who leaned close and spoke quietly, the tone of someone delivering useful information privately, the tone of an ally. The words were simple. There was someone outside who wanted to talk, someone with a message from the people. Rico was working for something that needed to be said away from the room where too many ears were pointed in the wrong directions. Rico believed it because he wanted to. Because the night had gone the way he had been told it would go, He had said what he was sent to say in public in front of the right people, and he had walked away from the table standing upright. In his accounting, the job was done, and what came next was the part where he found out what it had earned him. He stepped into the alley and the door closed behind him. Nat Johnson was standing 8 feet away directly in front of him, hands at his sides, completely still. He was 41 years old, and lean in the specific way of men who have never carried unnecessary weight in any sense of the word. His face was unremarkable in the way that made it difficult to describe afterward, not distinctive enough to remember clearly, not forgettable enough to dismiss. He had been doing this kind of work for Bumpy since 1946, and had developed over those 7 years the particular economy of motion that came from never doing more than the situation required. The second man was at the far end of the alley. He had not moved since taking his position 20 minutes earlier. His presence closed the geometry of the space. There was one direction available, and it was toward Nat. Rico registered the situation in the space between one heartbeat and the next. His hand moved toward his jacket. Nat said, "Don't." One word, delivered without emphasis or urgency in the tone of a man stating a condition rather than issuing a warning. The way you might tell someone the stove is hot, not alarmed, simply accurate. Rico's hand stopped moving. He stood there for a full 3 seconds, running 2 different sets of calculations simultaneously. The instinct calculation was clear and correct. 2 men closed space, no exit, the man in front of him, someone who had been in this specific type of situation enough times that his stillness was not tension, but readiness. The ego calculation kept returning different results. He had just walked out of that room having said what he said to Bumpy Johnson's face, which meant he was protected, which meant whoever sent him had made arrangements, which meant this was something else. The ego calculation was wrong, and he knew it and moved anyway. The gun came out and discharged once into the brick wall on the left side of the alley. The sound was sharp and enclosed and swallowed almost entirely by the narrow space between buildings, loud enough to register, contained enough that the street on either end absorbed it as something ambiguous, something that might have been a car, backfiring, something that the residents of those blocks had trained themselves to assess quickly and then decide not to investigate. Nat had moved left when the gun came out, not back. This was the detail that undid Rico's plan entirely, because the plan, insofar as there was one, assumed that a drawn weapon created distance. It did not in Nat's case create distance. It created a different angle. The gun hit the wet alley floor. Rico followed it with a sound that was more surprise than pain, the sound of a body encountering concrete faster than it expected to. The second impact came before he had fully processed the first. Several people on the surrounding street later mentioned hearing something, a sharp sound, possibly metallic, possibly something else, but when the block was canvassed in the days that followed, not one person was willing to describe in detail what they had heard or when. Nat worked without speaking. There was nothing to explain and no one present who required explanation. Rico had been handed a script by people who had calculated his usefulness and his disposability simultaneously. And he had performed his function, and the function was complete. What happened in the alley was the accounting that followed performance in that world. Not punishment, exactly more like the closing of a transaction. The alley was empty within 6 minutes of Rico stepping into it. The gun was gone. The only thing that remained was a dark trail along the left side of the alley floor, starting near the center, and ending at a door set into the building wall that faced the next street. A door with no handle on the outside and no number above it, and no record in any city document of what it connected to, or where it led. Nat returned to the club through the front entrance 38 minutes later. He ordered a club soda. He sat 2 tables from Bumpy's corner, and did not speak, and did not look in Bumpy's direction. Bumpy did not look at him. The saxophone player had resumed. The room had reconstituted itself around the event the way rooms in Harlem reconstituted themselves, not by pretending nothing had happened, but by absorbing what had happened into the ongoing fabric of the evening and continuing. In Harlem, a man disappearing was not a conclusion. It was a sentence written in a language that everyone in the neighborhood read fluently and no one translated for outsiders. The sentence had been written. It would be read by morning. But Rico had not been the only name written that night. He had simply been the first one. The office above the hardware store smelled like two things simultaneously, and always machine oil rising from the floor below, and old paper from the filing cabinet in the corner, whose drawer had not closed fully since 1948. The smell combination was specific enough that Bumpy associated it with a particular mental state, the state of sitting with information and deciding what to do with it, which was a significant portion of what running Harlem's financial underground actually required on a day-to-day basis. The first missing envelope arrived as an absence on a Tuesday morning. Or rather, it did not arrive, which was itself a form of arrival, the arrival of a problem that announced itself through what was not present rather than what was. The envelope was from a dry goods shop on 123rd Street that had been paying on schedule for 4 years. Not a large amount, not a strategically significant location. But consistent, and consistency in the network Bumpy maintained was the whole of the value. A network that moved reliably was worth 10 times a network that moved large amounts unpredictably. He noted it and waited. By Thursday morning, 5 more envelopes had not arrived. 3 shops, 1 numbers runner, operating out of a barber shop on 121st, and a building superintendent who managed 2 properties and had been part of the arrangement since 1950. Different locations, different types of operation. No obvious geographic cluster, they were spread across a 12-block area in a pattern that did not immediately suggest coordination. Bumpy sat with this for 24 hours before he moved. Not because he was uncertain about what it meant, but because the way you responded to a signal of this type determined what signals came next. Moving too fast communicated alarm. Moving too slow communicated indifference. The correct speed was deliberate, fast enough to show attentiveness, measured enough to show control. He sent 1 man on foot to visit 3 of the locations. The instruction was simple. Go in as a customer, make a small purchase, have a brief conversation about nothing in particular, and listen for the specific quality of how people spoke when they were managing information they had been told not to share. The man came back with the same answer from all 3 locations expressed in different words. They said they've made other arrangements. The phrase landed in the room with physical weight. Bumpy repeated it once quietly, and then did not speak for a long moment. Other arrangements meant a conversation had occurred without his knowledge. It meant someone had moved through his territory systematically enough to reach multiple unconnected operations and make offers compelling enough that those operations had accepted and had done all of this without triggering a single report back to him through the network of relationships he maintained specifically to prevent this kind of movement from happening undetected. That level of operational invisibility required preparation. Significant preparation. The kind that took months and resources and a detailed understanding of how the network functioned, which locations were connected to, which people were most likely to respond to, financial incentive versus which would require a different kind of persuasion. He began following the money. Not personally, he moved through a chain of people who owed him favors rather than cash, which made them more difficult to purchase away from him than the people who owed him money. Over 4 days, through a series of careful conversations conducted at careful distances, a picture assembled itself from its component pieces. The approach had been systematic and patient. Starting at the geographic edges of his territory and moving inward 1 location at a time, spaced far enough apart that no single person would notice the pattern unless they were looking at the whole map simultaneously. Each approach had been made by a different intermediary, never the same face twice, never the same method of first contact. The offers had been reasonable rather than dramatic, which was itself a sign of sophistication. Dramatic offers created conversation. Reasonable offers created quiet decisions. Financial records from establishments in that area during the relevant period contain a series of unexplained transactions that were noted by at least one external auditor, but never formally examined by any regulatory or investigative body. The name that surfaced through two separate channels on the same afternoon was Carlo Vitale. Bumpy knew the name by reputation rather than encounter. Vitale was 44 years old, trained as an accountant, and had spent the past decade working as what his associates described as a development consultant, a term that meant he identified neighborhoods whose existing power structures had weaknesses and systematically acquired them, through financial pressure rather than violence, at least initially. He had done this in 3 other locations in the northeastern United States over the preceding 8 years. In each case, the process had followed a similar pattern: identify the network, map its dependencies, find the people within it who could be turned, begin redirecting financial flows, and allow the existing power structure to weaken through erosion rather than confrontation. Violence came later, if it came at all, and by the time it came, the financial architecture was already in place, and the violence was simply enforcement rather than acquisition. It was Bumpy recognized with the cold clarity of a man understanding something. He would have preferred not to understand a more sophisticated method than anything he had previously encountered. The organizations that had challenged him before had challenged him directly, with people with weapons, with the straightforward language of territorial dispute. Vitale was not disputing territory. He was purchasing it one transaction at a time from the inside out. Rico slamming his glass down in the club had not been a provocation. Bumpy understood this now with complete certainty. It had been a calibration, a deliberate insertion of visible aggression designed to produce a response that could be used. If Bumpy had reacted fast and loud, the response would have justified an immediate escalation of Vitale's timeline. The silence, the controlled response, the disappearance of Rico without public incident, Vitale would have read that as Bumpy choosing restraint out of weakness rather than strategy. Either response fed the same machine. Bumpy stood at the office window and looked out at Lenox Avenue for a long time. The street was doing what the street always did, moving, transacting, living at the specific pitch of a Harlem morning that had no idea it was being discussed in a room above a hardware store by a man who was beginning to understand the full dimensions of what had been built around him. The money flowing through those streets had been redirected in amounts that were individually small and collectively enormous. The network he had spent 15 years constructing had been mapped by someone who had never once walked its blocks, and the young man named Rico, who had sat across from him in the club and turned his back and walked away, had been nothing more than a measuring instrument sent to take a reading and discarded the moment the reading was complete. Bumpy turned from the window and sat back down at the desk. Rico had been the opening signal. The question now was how far into the transmission Vitale already was, and whether there was still enough of the network intact to answer back. The meeting room above the barber shop on 127th Street held 8 people comfortably, and 12 people when the situation required it. That Friday evening, Bumpy had called 11 of his most trusted men, the ones who had been with him long enough to have earned the right to sit in a room where real information moved. The curtains were pulled. The door was locked from the inside. A single bulb hung from the ceiling and threw yellow light across faces that all wore the same expression-controlled attention. The specific alertness of men who understood that being summoned meant something had gone wrong, and that the wrong thing might still be in the room with them. Bumpy stood at the head of the table and did not sit down for the first 20 minutes. He laid out what he knew: the missing envelopes, the redirected payments, the name Carlo Vitale, the pattern of approach that had moved inward from the edges of his territory over the course of weeks. He spoke without notes, without raising his voice, in the flat, precise tone of a man who had already done his grieving privately and was now operating in a different register entirely. Then he said, "Someone in this room or close enough to touch this room has been talking." No one moved. The bulb buzzed faintly. Somewhere below them, a barber's chair creaked against the floor. Bumpy had not come to that conclusion from instinct alone. The pattern of Vitale's approach was too accurate, too perfectly sequenced, to have been assembled from street observation. Whoever had built Vitale's map of Harlem's financial network had access to specific information delivery schedules, collection routes, the names of shops that paid in cash versus those that paid through intermediaries. That kind of detail did not leak through careless conversation. It was written down somewhere and read by someone who had been paid to read it. He had spent 3 days narrowing the list before calling this meeting. By the time he locked the door, he already knew. He was not here to discover the answer. He was here to see what the answer would do when the room closed around it. Elijah Curtis had worked alongside Bumpy for 9 years. He was 34, quiet, meticulous, the kind of man who remembered every number he had ever heard and never needed to be told something twice. He managed the scheduling ledger, a small brown notebook always in his inside jacket pocket that contained the movement patterns of every collection in Bumpy's network. Dates, times, locations, amounts. A complete operational map of Harlem's underground economy written in Elijah's careful handwriting. Bumpy looked at him directly and said, "Show me the book, Elijah." The room temperature dropped by several degrees in the following silence. Elijah did not reach for his jacket immediately. He held Bumpy's gaze for 2 full seconds, long enough to be readable, not long enough to be defiant, and then he reached inside his coat and placed the notebook on the table. Bumpy did not open it. He slid it across the table to the man on his right, who opened it to the last page and read what was there. Then he turned the book around and pushed it back toward the center of the table so that anyone leaning forward could see. The last 8 entries had been copied, not removed, copied, in a slightly different ink and handwriting that was almost identical to Elijah's, but not quite at the bottom margin of each page. The copies were neat, deliberate, and recent. Some informal accounts from that period mention an unnamed internal source connected to Harlem's underground networks, though no identity was ever officially confirmed or documented. Elijah did not deny it. That was the detail that settled into the room like smoke, heavier than an accusation, heavier than a confession. He sat with his hands flat on the table and said in a voice that was remarkably steady, "I was told I would be protected. I was told that what was coming was already decided, and that the people who stayed on the right side of it would be taken care of." Bumpy looked at him for a long time. "Who told you that?" "Someone above, Carlo." Elijah said. "Someone I never met in person." The message came through a third party. I was given a number to call. I was given cash, 6 times over 6 months left, in an envelope under the 3rd step of the stairwell at my building. The specific architecture of it, the distance, the layers, the cash left in a stairwell, told Bumpy more than Elijah's words did. This was not Brooklyn improvisation. This was a structure built by someone who had done this before in other cities with other people. Someone who understood that the most dangerous asset in any territory was not the man at the top, but the quiet, meticulous man who kept the books. Bumpy pulled a chair out and sat down across from Elijah. He folded his hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. "You're going to tell me everything you told them," he said. "Every number, every schedule, every name you passed along. And then you're going to tell me how the messages came back. Every detail." Elijah nodded once. Bumpy did not raise his hand. He did not signal anyone. The other 10 men in the room sat perfectly still and watched because they understood, all of them, without being told, that Elijah was more valuable breathing and talking than he was the alternative. Bumpy needed the full shape of what had been sold before he could understand what was still exposed. The most dangerous betrayal is always the one that comes from the person who knows the rhythm of your days, who knows which phone you answer first, which door you use when you're tired, which name makes you pause before you speak. Elijah had known all of those things for 9 years. And for 6 months, someone above Carlo Vitale had been listening. The phone in the back room of the hardware store was a rotary model, black with a crack along the base that had been there since 1949. Bumpy had used it for years because it was registered to a business name that had not existed since 1946. and therefore appeared on no list that any one official maintained with any regularity. He sat down in front of it at 9:10 on a Saturday evening, 2 days after the meeting above the barber shop, and dialed a number that Elijah had provided the third number in the chain 2 steps removed from wherever Carlo Vitale actually received his calls. The line rang 4 times. Then a voice answered, male middle-aged, with the flattened vowels of someone who had grown up in Lower Manhattan and spent decades carefully removing the accent without fully succeeding. Bumpy said, "Tell him Bumpy Johnson wants to sit down. 1 meeting, neutral location. I'll come alone if he wants. But I need him to hear what I know before anyone does anything that cannot be reversed." There was a pause. Then the voice said, "I'll pass it along." The line went dead. Bumpy sat with the phone in his hand for a moment before replacing it. He had made the offer because it was the correct tactical move, not because he believed it would be accepted, but because refusing a direct offer of conversation removed any ambiguity about what came next. If Vitale declined, the language of what followed was clear to everyone involved. The response came back through the same chain 14 hours later, delivered verbally by a man Bumpy did not recognize who appeared at the hardware store during business hours, bought a box of nails he clearly had no use for, and said quietly at the counter, while the owner was in the back, "Mr. Vitale says Harlem already has a new owner. He says the paperwork is mostly done. He says you should think about what city you want to move to." The man left without waiting for a response. Bumpy stood at the counter for a long moment after he left. The street outside was bright, and ordinary women with shopping bags, children running ahead of their mothers, a delivery truck double-parked outside the pharmacy. Harlem at noon looked exactly like what it had always looked like. And somewhere below the surface of all that ordinary movement, a man who had never once walked these streets believed he had already purchased them. Several officers from the 28th Precinct faced internal review proceedings that year for conduct-related matters, though the associated case files were closed before any findings were formally entered into the record. The police connection was not incidental. Elijah had confirmed it. Vitale's operation moved through Harlem with a specific kind of confidence that came from knowing which corners were being watched and which ones had been quietly cleared. 3 officers in particular had been on Vitale's indirect payroll for at least a year, receiving cash through a bail bondsman on 116th Street who served as an unwitting intermediary. They did not know who was ultimately paying them. They knew only that the money arrived, and that certain calls were not responded to quickly, and certain reports were written with deliberate gaps. When law enforcement becomes a service that money can rent, violence is not an escalation. It is simply the next available tool. Bumpy called Nat that evening and spoke for less than 2 minutes. He did not describe the conversation at the hardware store. He did not outline a plan. He said one sentence that Nat had been waiting with complete patience to hear for the better part of a week. "We're not negotiating anymore." Nat said nothing for a moment. Then, "How far?" Bumpy said, "All the way." He placed the phone down carefully, as if the weight of what he had just decided required the gesture to be done correctly. Outside the window, Harlem was moving through its Saturday evening, the clubs opening, the numbers being settled, the long, slow rhythms of a neighborhood that had survived everything it had ever faced. He had built this, 15 years of specific decisions, specific relationships, specific restraints. He had held it together through pressure that would have broken men with more resources and less patience. And a man who had never once looked a Harlem resident in the eye had decided from a distance that it was already his. The war did not begin with that phone call. It had begun weeks earlier in ledger entries and redirected envelopes, and a young man named Rico who had been handed a script and told to perform it in public. But the phone call was the moment Bumpy stopped responding to what was being done to him and started deciding what he was going to do back. He picked up a different phone, older, connected to nothing official, and began making calls that would take most of the night. The warehouse on the west side of 125th Street had been operating as a dry goods storage facility on paper since 1951. In practice, it was a processing point, a place where cash from Brooklyn crew operations moving into Harlem was counted, packaged, and redistributed before continuing north or disappearing entirely into the accounting structure that Vitale's people had built around it. It was not a glamorous location. It smelled like cardboard and mildew and the kind of cheap cleaning solution that never quite covered what it was applied over. But it was functional, and it was until the third week of that October considered secure. Bumpy's men moved on it at 2 in the morning on a Wednesday. There were 6 of them, chosen specifically because they were reliable, and because none of them had been part of any operation that Elijah's notebook could have documented. Bumpy had spent 2 days reconstructing which of his people existed inside the information that had been sold, and which existed outside it. The 6 men who went to that warehouse were, as far as he could determine, unknown to Vitale's network entirely. They entered through a side loading door that had been described to Bumpy by a man who had made 3 deliveries there in the past month, and noticed with the particular observational habit of someone trained to notice that the lock was a model that could be managed from the outside with the right tool in under 40 seconds. It took 30. Inside, they found what they were looking for: 2 large metal lock boxes containing cash. A ledger book that was not Elijah's but served a similar function. A list of every shop, every building, every numbers operation in a 12-block radius that had been brought under Vitale's financial structure over the past several months. Names, amounts, dates of first contact. It was in its way a mirror of the book that Elijah had been maintaining for Bumpy, a complete operational record of what was being built in Harlem, without Harlem's consent. They had been in the building for 11 minutes when the lights came on. All of them simultaneously, every overhead fixture in the warehouse flooding the space with flat white light that destroyed any tactical advantage the darkness had provided, and from 3 separate positions from behind stacked pallets, and along the upper catwalk, and through a door at the far end that opened outward rather than in, men appeared with weapons already raised. The ambush had been waiting. Newspapers reported a warehouse fire on West 125th Street that Wednesday morning, noting that the building was unoccupied at the time and that no injuries were recorded. The actual account of what happened inside that building existed only in the street-level conversations that followed. 3 of Bumpy's 6 men did not come back out of that building. 2 made it out through the side door they had entered, moving fast and low with the specific desperate efficiency of men who had accepted that survival was the only available objective. The 6th, a man named Douglas who had been with Bumpy since 1948, made it half a block before he sat down heavily against a building wall and did not get up again. Nat received the call at 3:45 in the morning. He arrived at the location where the 2 survivors had gone to ground within 20 minutes, listened to what they described for approximately 8 minutes without interrupting, and then made a call himself. The new name in the account the survivors gave was one that Bumpy had not anticipated, and that once introduced, clarified several things that had previously seemed like operational coincidence. Detective Raymond Harris had been with the 28th Precinct for 11 years. He was known within the department as thorough and unremarkable, the kind of officer who cleared a respectable number of cases without ever being connected to anything that attracted outside attention. What he was known for, outside the department in the specific circles where Harlem's underground economy intersected with law enforcement's awareness of it, was considerably different. Harris knew everything that moved through his precinct. He maintained that knowledge not as a public servant, but as a commodity information, sold to whoever was currently paying the highest rate for it. The survivors described him specifically. He had been at the warehouse. Not inside, not with a weapon, but standing at the end of the block in a dark coat watching the building, positioned in a way that someone who did not know who he was might have mistaken for a standard patrol presence. Someone who did know who he was would have understood immediately that his presence meant the operation had been cleared in advance, that the men inside the warehouse had known Bumpy's team was coming, known which entrance they would use. Bumpy received the full account at 5 in the morning, sitting in the hardware store with the lights off, and the street outside beginning its slow pre-dawn transition from empty to occupied. He had understood intellectually since the meeting above the barber shop that Vitale had been building this for longer than was comfortable to consider. But there is a specific difference between understanding something as information and encountering it as three men who do not come back from a straightforward operation. The warehouse had not just been a tactical defeat. It was a demonstration, a deliberate, precisely executed demonstration, that Vitale's preparation extended to the police, to the streets, to the specific movements of Bumpy's own people. He had not walked into an ambush. He had been invited into one. Nat said when the account was finished, they knew which door, they knew the number of men. They had the lights rigged. Bumpy nodded once. "They've been ready for this conversation longer than we have," he said. Outside 125th Street was beginning to fill with the ordinary sounds of a Harlem morning. A bus pulling away from a stop, a shop door opening, someone calling a name from a window 3 floors up. The neighborhood was waking up without knowing that 3 of its own were gone, and that the man who had protected it for 15 years was sitting in a dark room at 5 in the morning, looking at the shape of something that had been built around him while he was looking the other way. The war Bumpy had chosen 2 nights ago was already older than he had known. The sky over Harlem that Thursday night was the specific shade of black that comes when cloud cover blocks every star, and the streetlights below can only push their orange glow so far before it dies. No moon, no wind. The kind of night that made sounds carried differently, footsteps, sharper voices, flatter, the distant rumble of a passing truck, somehow closer than it should have been. Bumpy had not slept in 31 hours. He sat in the hardware store with Nat across the table from him and a map of the northern Manhattan street grid spread between them. Not a commercial map, a hand-drawn one updated over years, marked with the specific notations that only made sense to the 2 men looking at it. Collection points, contact locations, the buildings that mattered and the ones that only appeared to. It was in its way a portrait of everything Bumpy had built, 15 years of decisions rendered in pencil and ink on a piece of paper that could not be replaced if lost. He had 2 options, and he had known since 5 that morning what they were. The first was withdrawal. Not permanent, he was not built for permanent, and anyone who knew him understood that, but strategic. Pull back. Let Vitale believe the territory was conceded. Move quietly. Rebuild the network from positions that had not been compromised, and wait for the moment when Vitale's organization overextended, which all organizations eventually did when they expanded faster than their ability to hold what they had taken. It was a patient option. It was a survivable option. The second option was to hit the center directly. Elijah, in the 2 days since the meeting above the barber shop, had provided everything. Not because he had been tortured. Bumpy had not touched him, and Nat had not touched him, and this restraint was itself a kind of pressure that Elijah had found harder to withstand than pain. He had been kept in a back room, fed, given water, and left alone for long stretches while the men outside went about their work. The isolation and the silence and the specific uncertainty of not knowing what was coming had done what force would have taken longer to accomplish. Among the information Elijah provided was the location and schedule of a meeting that Carlo Vitale attended in person once every 3 weeks, a face-to-face gathering with his senior people at a location in Lower Harlem that had been chosen specifically because it sat at the boundary between his expanding territory and the remaining edges of Bumpy's. It was in Vitale's operational logic a statement as much as a meeting. He was holding his planning sessions inside a neighborhood he considered already acquired. The next meeting was in 4 days. Nat had listened to all of it without speaking, When Bumpy finished laying out the second option, Nat looked at the map for a long time and then looked up. "You understand what you're doing if we go at that meeting," he said. "You're not hitting a Brooklyn crew. You're hitting a Sicilian-connected operation with reach into Lower Manhattan, reach into the police department, and enough distance built into its structure that Carlo can claim he was never there, even if we put him in the ground. Once we do that, once we cross that line, there is no conversation that happens afterward. There is no negotiation. There is no going back to the table. Whatever comes after that comes all the way." Bumpy said, "I know." Nat said, "I need you to say it out loud. Not to me. To yourself. Because once I start making calls tonight, the thing we're talking about becomes the thing that's happening, and some of what happens won't be something either of us controls." The room was silent for a moment. The buzzing bulb overhead, the faint smell of machine oil from the floor below. The map between them with its 15 years of careful notation. People who studied the power structures of that era have noted that the decision made in that room represented one of the most consequential and, by many accounts, most dangerous turning points in Harlem's underground history during that period. Bumpy placed both hands flat on the map and looked at it one more time. He looked at the collection points, the contact locations, the buildings that mattered. He looked at what 15 years looked like when it was drawn on paper. Then he folded the map carefully the way a man folds something he is not sure he will need again, and placed it in his jacket pocket. "Make the calls," he said. Nat nodded once. He stood up, put on his coat, and walked to the door. He paused there for a moment with his hand on the frame. "Douglas had a daughter," he said. 8 years old. I'm going to make sure she's taken care of before any of this starts moving." Bumpy said nothing, but he nodded. Nat left. The door closed. Bumpy sat alone in the hardware store with the buzzing bulb and the smell of machine oil and the specific weight of a decision that had already passed the point where it could be reconsidered. Outside, Harlem was dark and quiet and had no idea what was 4 days away. The building on the south edge of 118th Street had been vacant since a fire in 1950 cleared its upper 2 floors and made the remainder technically uninhabitable by any standard the city cared to apply when it was paying attention. The ground floor had been used intermittently since then, storage for a nearby restaurant that had since closed a temporary shelter that lasted 1 winter, and most recently, as nothing at all. The windows were boarded. The front door was chained. The smell inside was char and standing damp, and the specific staleness of a space that had not moved air properly in years. Vitale's people had been using it for 3 weeks. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. 8 people confirmed: Vitale himself, 4 senior members of his acquisition operation, and 3 men whose function was security, and whose presence meant the location had been considered safe enough to bring someone worth protecting. Bumpy arrived at the building at 8:15 with 7 men. They came from 4 different directions on foot in the specific unhurried way of people who belonged in the neighborhood and were simply moving through it. They entered through a basement access point on the east side of the building that Elijah had described in detail. A door behind a collapsed section of exterior wall that had not been resealed after whatever work had last been done there. It opened inward and was not locked. Inside, they moved through the ground floor in complete darkness. No flashlights. Bumpy had walked the route twice in his mind from Elijah's description and had communicated it to his men in a single session the previous evening, repeated until everyone could recite it without prompting. Left at the base of the interior stairs, along the north wall to the second support column. Stop there and hold position until the signal. They were in place by 9. The waiting was the hardest part. 45 minutes in a dark building in silence, standing still enough that the sounds of the street outside became louder as the mind adjusted. Bumpy could hear his own breathing. He could hear the man to his left, shifting his weight slightly every few minutes. He could hear faintly the distant sound of music from somewhere on the block. Someone's radio through a closed window, something slow and brass-heavy that seemed wrong for the specific occasion. At 9:58, the front of the building made a sound, then light. Not all the lights there was no functioning electrical in the building, but flashlights, multiple moving through the front entrance and spreading across the ground floor from the opposite direction. Vitale's people entering from the front, moving toward the center of the space where a table and several chairs had been set up at some point in the preceding days. Bumpy waited. He needed them settled. He needed the security men positioned and stationary before anything moved, because moving security was unpredictable in a way that stationary security was not. He counted to 40. Then he gave the signal, a single sharp knock against the support column, and the darkness on his side of the room became extremely loud and extremely fast simultaneously. No official record exists of what occurred inside that building on the night in question, and the account presented here is drawn entirely from the street-level testimony that circulated in the weeks that followed. What happened in the next 4 minutes was the kind of violence that is difficult to describe with precision, because the people inside it were operating on instinct and proximity rather than sight. Flashlights went down in the first seconds, whether deliberately or as a consequence of the initial collision of the two sides. The result was the same. The space became a problem of sound and touch, and the specific terrible logic of knowing that anyone moving toward you in the dark was not on your side. Carlo Vitale was hit in the first 30 seconds. Not fatally, he was not in the immediate chaos a primary target so much as a man who was in the wrong position when the room became what it became. He went down hard against the far wall and did not get up under his own power for the remainder of what followed. 3 of his men did not survive the building. 2 of Bumpy's men were badly hurt. 1 would recover fully. The other would not use his left hand again with any reliability, which was a loss he described in the years that followed, with a specific matter-of-fact brevity that was more affecting than complaint would have been. Elijah Curtis had been brought to the building that night by Vitale's people. This was not something Bumpy had known in advance, and when it became clear in the aftermath, when the building was being accounted for, when the living were identified and the dead were confirmed, it carried a particular cold logic that required no explanation. Elijah had been an asset. Assets in that world were maintained only as long as their value exceeded the risk of their existence. The moment Vitale's people understood that Elijah had returned to the room above the barber shop and stayed there for 2 days, his value inverted entirely. He was found near the rear of the building. He had been shot twice from behind with a weapon that was not recovered. He had been running toward the back wall when it happened. Bumpy stood in the dark building for a long time after it was over. His men moved around him, checking accounting, preparing to leave in the same quiet, distributed way they had arrived. The smell of gunpowder had layered itself over the char, and damp, sharp, and chemical, and unmistakable the specific smell of a room where something final had occurred. He looked at where Elijah had fallen and did not speak. Then he turned and walked toward the east side of the building, through the basement access door, and back out into Harlem. The street was quiet. The radio music from earlier had stopped. The sky was still the same moonless black it had been all evening. He walked 3 blocks north before he said anything to Nat, who had been beside him, in silence since they left the building. "Is Carlo alive?" he asked. "Yes," Nat said. Bumpy nodded. "Then it's not finished." "No," Nat said. "But it's different now." The morning came in gray and slow, the way Harlem mornings came in October, light arriving without warmth, the sky the color of old concrete, the streets filling gradually with the sounds of a neighborhood resuming its daily operations without any visible acknowledgement of what the previous night had contained. Delivery trucks, school shoes on pavement, the metal roll of a shop gate going up. Life continuing in the specific way that life continues in places that have learned not to stop for what happens in the dark. Carlo Vitale left New York within 72 hours of the building on 118th Street. He did not announce this. He did not hold a meeting or issue a directive. He simply was present in the city on one day and absent from it the next, and the absence carried its own communication clear to everyone in the network he had been building, clear to the people in Lower Manhattan who had provided his backing, clear to Detective Harris, who received no further contact from any of the numbers he had been using, and understood with the practiced speed of a man who had navigated transitions like this before that the arrangement was over. Harris filed a transfer request to a precinct in Queens within the week. It was approved without comment. The first envelope arrived back at the office above the hardware store on a Monday morning, a shop on 124th Street that had stopped paying 6 weeks earlier. The man who delivered it did not offer an explanation. He set it on the counter, nodded once, and left. By the end of that week, 4 more had followed. By the end of the month, the network had largely reconstituted itself, not entirely, and not without gaps where shops had been absorbed deeply enough into Vitale's structure that the connection was difficult to fully reverse, but substantially. Harlem came back to Bumpy the way it had originally come to him, not through a single dramatic moment, but through the accumulation of small, unremarked decisions made by people who had weighed their options and chosen the one that had demonstrated it could last. What it cost him was different from what it restored. Marcus Webb, who had been with Bumpy since 1946, did not come back from the warehouse on 125th Street. Douglas, who had sat down against a building wall 3 blocks away and not gotten up again, left behind the 8-year-old daughter that Nat had mentioned in the hardware store. James Colton, who had lost the reliable use of his left hand in the building on 118th Street, would spend the following years managing a numbers operation on the East Side, functional, respected, but operating at a different level than the work he had done before. And Elijah. 9 years. A man who had known every rhythm of the operation, who had sat in every planning meeting, who had eaten at Bumpy's table, and been trusted with the book that mapped everything. The betrayal was not something Bumpy discussed. People who knew him during that period noted that he did not speak Elijah's name after that night, not in anger, not in explanation, not in the kind of public accounting that might have served as warning to others. The silence on the subject was itself the statement. Some accounts from people who knew Harlem during that period described the outcome as a liberation, a neighborhood that had come close to being absorbed by an outside power and had defended itself. Others described it differently, noting that what followed was a consolidation rather than a loosening, that the demonstration of what happened to those who moved against Bumpy had made certain conversations impossible in ways they had not been before. Both descriptions were accurate. They were simply measuring different things. Nat Johnson moved into the role that the events of that month had created for him, not formally, not with any announcement, but through the specific gravity that comes from being the person who is present at every consequential moment and who handles each one with the same flat competence. He spoke less than he had before. He smiled less. He had always been a contained man, but the containment after that period had a different quality. The difference between a man who had not yet seen certain things and a man who had seen them and filed them away in a place he did not revisit unnecessarily. Bumpy asked him once several months later whether he had any regrets about how the month had gone. Nat thought about it for a genuine moment before answering, which was itself notable. "I regret Douglas," he said. "And Marcus. And Colton's hand. Those I carry." He paused. "The rest of it was the cost of the decision. You make the decision, you pay the cost. Regretting the cost after you've already paid it is just spending it twice." Bumpy did not respond to that, but he did not disagree with it either. The name Rico was never spoken again in any room that Bumpy occupied. Not because it had been forbidden, no such directive was ever issued, but because the name had ceased to carry any meaning that was worth the breath required to say it. Rico had been a signal, a measurement, a piece of someone else's opening move. He had served his function and been discarded by the people who sent him, before the night he was sent was even finished. In a world where names carried weight proportional to the decisions attached to them, Rico had no weight left. Harlem moved forward. It always had. The specific texture of how it moved, who it deferred to, who it paid, whose name it used carefully, and whose it used freely. Those things had shifted in the ways that the month's events had shifted them, and they would shift again, because they always did. But on a Tuesday morning in November, with the light coming in gray and cold, off the Hudson, and the city, making its ordinary sounds in every direction, Bumpy Johnson walked from the hardware store to a coffee shop 2 blocks north, sat down at a table by the window, ordered black coffee and watched Harlem go about its morning. He had built this. It had nearly been taken. It had not been taken. That was the whole of it. That was what 15 years and one very specific month had produced: a man sitting at a window with black coffee watching a neighborhood that was still his, at a cost that he would spend the rest of his life understanding the full weight of. Outside, 125th Street moved through its morning without pause, without acknowledgement, without any visible memory of what it had contained. Harlem never explained itself. It simply continued. Harlem never put his name on a monument. It did not need to. Every shop that stayed open, every block that held its ground, every morning that came without a stranger's hand, reaching into the neighborhood's pocket, that was the monument. Built not in stone but in silence. In the specific silence of people who knew what had almost happened and chose every day afterward not to speak it aloud. Carlo vanished. Harris transferred. The envelopes came back. But 3 men never came home, and Bumpy Johnson sat with that weight every morning for the rest of his life, the cost of the decision paid in full, carried quietly. If stories like this matter to you, the ones that never made the front page, consider subscribing. There are more buried beneath the surface of every city you think you know. Now tell us when a man protects his community through methods the law never sanctioned. Do you call that justice? And if you had been in that room the night it all began, would you have stayed silent or spoken up?